So I'm going to talk to you about the first minute of cold water immersion. And I've heard quite a lot about evidence-based research since I've been here, and one of the primary objectives of the foundation is to support that kind of research. So thank you very much, Brendan and John and the team, for inviting me to talk about this. Now, I'm conscious that this is about the third time I've spoken to this conference, and actually I think it's almost exactly the same people here as I've spoken to before. So I'm not going to give you the 4 stages of immersion associated with particular risk. I'm not going to do. What I'm going to do is just to try and give you a feel. I don't care if you're not particularly understanding or interested in what's being said. I just want to give you a feel for the amount of work, research work, and evidence that goes into the understanding of just the first minute of an immersion. Okay? So the reason is there's lots of information out there now, and people can very easily become instant experts. But an expert is somebody who has more than knowledge and slides. They have an understanding of what goes on, which is one of the reasons why I'm not going to speak about psychology today, because John's over there and he'll ping that I don't know what I'm talking about in a very short period of time. I may have one slide at the end just to annoy him. Okay, so really what we're talking about is change. Your body is designed to try and keep everything exactly the same. Homeostasis. It wants to have the same temperature, it wants to have the same oxygen content, it wants to have the same blood biochemistry, all of those things. And the thing that causes it a problem is a perturbation, a change, a stimulus to which it needs to respond. And that really is what happens in the first minute of immersion. Why should we be interested in the physiological responses? Well, I've argued in the past that unless you understand the physiology of what happens when somebody's in cold water or in the sea or in water, you can't begin to understand the pathophysiology, because actually much more information is gleaned from a fatal accident from the cause of death than just the cause of death. It's very easy to write drowning, hypothermia. The real advances come from an understanding of why that drowning occurred or how that person became hypothermic. And that's where we need to understand the basic physiology. Right, and we get a little bit obsessed, and I've written the words morbidity and mortality on that slide because we get a little bit obsessed with drowning deaths, don't we? Everywhere we see, I quoted a figure this morning. And what we tend to not ignore, but seems to be given less priority, is the morbidity, the number of people who have life-changing experiences as a result of going into water. And that's an important consideration as well. We tend to get a little bit focused historically on hypothermia and change in deep body temperature. I'm not going to talk about that because I can only talk about the first minute of immersion, and it takes you at least half an hour to become hypothermic. So I'm going to be talking about what happens at the skin. Let me ask you a quick question. Shout out some answers. What percentage of your tissues of your body are within 1 inch of the surface? What percentage of the tissues of your body are within 1 inch of the surface? For those of you, that's 2.54 centimeters for those of you still in Europe. It's about that much. Okay, shout out some numbers. 75%. Oh, blimey, that's a good shout. Anybody think it's less than that? Yes, lots of people. Most people think it's, when you ask that question, they'll say it's about 10-20%. Well, you can work that out if you want to. You can work out the body in terms of spheres and cylinders, and when you do that, it's about 50%. So about half of the tissues of your body are within an inch of the surface of the skin, and that makes that part of the body pretty important, perhaps at least as important as the other 50%. And the other reason it's important is because the body has filled that area with receptors because it wants to know what's going on before significant changes occur to the center of the body where the vital organs are. So we have a whole bunch of receptors. And the thermoreceptors, which you can see here, are responding to absolute temperature, but particularly to change. We're back to that word change or dynamic. You'll hear it lots of times. The cold receptors, they're about 0.18 millimeters below the surface of the skin. They have a conduction velocity that goes from about 2 meters per second to 30 meters a second, about 3 times faster than Usain Bolt, if you want to have an Olympics reference. You've got 3 or 4 times more cold receptors in your skin than you have warm, so we're particularly sensitive to cold because we're a tropical animal. We evolved in the tropics. And they're not normally distributed. So we've got about 20 cold points per centimetre square on the face and the lips, about 5 on the fingers, and about 1 on the broader surface of the body. So you get your face cold, you're stimulating a lot of receptors, and we'll come back to that later on. And that variation makes a difference. If you want to stop somebody sweating, you're much better cooling their forehead than you are cooling their leg, because you're stimulating more receptors. If you want somebody to feel comfortable, you're much better fanning their face than you are fanning their leg. We all know that, because when you have a fan, you don't do this, do you? You do that. It's physiology. It's simple. Some cold receptors, has anybody ever got into the bath that was really hot and actually had a shiver? Ooh, no? Well, you don't have such hot baths, maybe. That's cold receptors, because they have this paradoxical firing up at warm temperatures. We don't know how your body senses temperature. Isn't that an amazing thing to say? We're talking about cold, and we don't know how your body senses temperature. We know that there are a whole load of molecular mechanisms that may be involved in the transduction of a temperature into a response, but the precise nature of those mechanisms and how they work is not fully understood. We know there are different types of fibers, they fire at different rates, but how does the body actually say, that's temperature is that's colder, and I need to send that amount of afferent information to the brain? So you can see there are transient receptor potentials, leak channels, all different mechanisms proposed, and it's probably a combination of them. And I put this slide up because this is one of the potential mechanisms, and it's quite interesting. And so the cold receptors are the ones up here. You see this, the TRPM8 molecular channels. And you see they have a range of around about 10 to about 30 degrees. And you notice down here as well, they're also stimulated by mint. And that's why when you go and buy your products for showering, it's got mint in it because that's stimulating cold. And that's the freshness that you feel. That's the stimulation of those channels by mint or eucalyptus. Menthol. And we've actually done studies spraying people with menthol to show that it's effectively the same as reducing mean skin temperature by about 0.5 degree, and you can habituate to that response in the same way as you can habituate to cold. Who likes a curry? Everyone likes a curry. So, okay, I just point this one out. Here we are. That's the warm receptors up here, TRPV1 molecular channels. They're warm receptors. They also respond to capsaicin, which is the hot ingredient in curry. That's why you sweat when you have a curry. So we're learning all the time, and it's the basis of our understanding of what goes on in the first minute of immersion. So there's a cold receptor sitting there at 32, feeling very comfortable, and then all of a sudden change comes along. The temperature just reduces by 2 degrees, and you get this big dynamic response, which then shows adaptation. And here we have it here now. It's firing a bit more than it was there because it's 2 degrees colder, but that's where all the action's occurring. And that cold receptor will adapt. If that were a pain receptor, it would keep up at a high level because pain receptors don't show that level of adaptation, because if you've got something that's doing you damage, you need to be reminded about it. How does that, so far I haven't really spoken about immersion, but here's where it all comes in. So there's the cold shock response. there I am before I go in the water, and I promise you I'm not going to talk to you about the cold shock response any more than this, because I've done that 3 times in the past to the same people. Here's pre-immersion, here's that dynamic response, and then 5 minutes in, you're showing adaptation. A perfect neural correlate of what's going on in your cold afferent pathway from receptor to stimulus, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And that ventilation that's going on is a hyperventilation, and it's blowing off CO2, and that can cause tetany, which stops your finger, small muscle spasms, and it can reduce the blood flow to your brain, which can cause disorientation and people to get do the wrong things. Now's a good time to introduce the autonomic nervous system. So you have an autonomic nervous system, one side of which tries to get you ready to fight or flight. So it increases heart rate, respiration, blood sugar, adrenaline and noradrenaline. And the other side tries to calm you down. So that's rest and digest, which is what we all like to do. And those two sides of that autonomic nervous system normally work as a yin and a yang. They're reciprocal. If you stimulate the sympathetic system, the parasympathetic system backs off. If you do it the other way around, this happens. Remember that. Now, it's pretty clear that the cold shock response is a sympathetic response. It's a sympathetic overdrive. It's driving breathing, it's driving. Your body is trying to get into fight or flight mode, even though you're not in a circumstance where you can do fight or flight. So it's actually a nice protective evolutionary response in a completely inappropriate environment. You're unable to control your breathing. You need to control your breathing because you're in a watery environment. Now, if I put somebody into water, by the time the water has got to the level of their scrotum, if they're a man, of course, then we also test females, they will have shown that response. It's a very rapid response, as you've seen, and that suggests that the pathways that are producing it are driven by neural mechanisms. And actually, we know that those pathways can stimulate breathing without actually having to go anywhere near the part of the brain that controls breathing. So it's a very, very direct route from cold receptor to and the first response when you go into cold water is what? It's a gasp. It's the gasp response. And that's why, and here's some research underpinning what we've just said, if you get people to hyperventilate, if I ask you to hyperventilate now, and then I ask you to hold your breath, you'll be able to hold your breath for longer because you've blown off lots of CO2, which is a respiratory driver. If you ask people to hyperventilate like mad and then put them into cold water, they can't breath hold any longer. They have exactly the same respiratory response. So here you see a piece of work we did some time ago. The only two you need to concentrate on are the open and the closed square. And in the closed square, people had hyperventilated for a minute before they went into the water, and they had exactly the same respiratory response in terms of number of breaths as those that hadn't hyperventilated. So there's no chemical brake put onto the respiratory response to immersion. It doesn't matter what biochemistry you've got, whether you've hyperventilated before you got, whether you knew you were going to get in and got nervous and hyperventilated, it doesn't change your respiratory response because it's such a direct connection between the skin receptors and the respiratory centers. And we also know, gasp, somebody said, that there are two different areas of the brain very close to each other. One is associated with breathing, and the other is associated with gasping. And it seems that the first area to get stimulated by cold water immersion is the area that is associated with gasping, and then the breathing gets driven. How do we know that? Because we've done studies where we've looked at the parts of the brain that get stimulated. So this is the brain of a rat that's been in 39 degrees Celsius water for 2 hours. And we're using a technique that identifies which neurons, which nervous pathways and receptors are stimulated, called them CFOS. And you'll notice that's a pretty clear slide. Look what happens when you do the same thing, but in cold water. The whole of that area is lighting up. And that technique is telling us that these are the areas, which you can see them there, the nucleus tractus solitarius, dorsal motor nucleus of the cranial nerve of the vagus, and the fourth ventricle, and the area postrema, are all being absolutely lit up by going into cold water immersion. Now that's important, because in a little while I'll be talking to you about what happens when you stimulate the cold shock response at the same time as you stimulate the diving response, i.e. the sympathetic response and the parasympathetic response, and that's where they meet. So we're fairly sure that we know that happens because we've got the evidence at a neuroanatomical and neurophysiological level. Okay, why doesn't your dog faint when it pants? So my dog spends a lot of time, huh? You can see there's a continuity into the depth of the content of this potential. So why doesn't your dog faint when it pants? My dog's now if I asked you to go one by one, you'd just keel over. Why doesn't that happen? Well, I tell you why it doesn't happen. It's because of the depth of the breathing. And what you have to understand, and actually it's amazing how many scientists don't, and you'll still see, most scientists report ventilation. They report the amount of air going in and out of the lung. That's relatively unimportant. What's really important is how much air is getting to the alveoli, which is where the gas exchange occurs. And so your ventilation is your respiratory frequency, the number of breaths, by the depth. But at the top of your lung, from there down to where the alveoli are, there's no gas exchange, and that's dead space. So when you breathe in and out, you go dead space air out, dead space in, no gas exchange. So about the first 150 mil for an average individual of your breathing, no gas exchange. So now what happens, if I go to 150 mil volume, I'll eventually pass out because I'll have suffocated, because I won't have got any oxygen down to the alveoli. And you can see it on this slide here. So what we've done here is we've looked at the minute ventilation, we've kept it exactly the same. That's 7.5 litres coming out of the mouth. And we said, well, if that's 50 breaths per minute, then your tidal volume, the amount you're taking is 150 mils, which is exactly the same as that dead space. Your actual alveolar ventilation is 0. Now, interestingly, if you go up now and it's 7.5 litres, and your breathing frequency is now just 10, which is more normal, and your depth of each breath is about 3/4 of a litre, now you're getting 6 litres of alveoli. That's good. That's good news. Your lungs are able to exchange gas, being able to do that. So what happens with cold shock? Well, this is impressed, and we're the first people, I think, to look at this across a range of environments. Cold shock stimulates the breathing frequency rather than the breathing depth. Yeah? And that's because it's an emotional response. It's not trying to exchange gas. It's not trying to sort out blood chemistry. It's the same kind of response you see in panic. John will tell you all about panic. He's doing it as we speak. He doesn't panic. I can tell he's not panicking. When you shiver, it's different. When you shiver, shivering is a form of exercise, and what you want to do is you want to increase the amount of air you're getting in and out of the lung to support the exercise of shivering. So your body somehow knows whether it needs to increase the frequency or the depth of breathing, and we don't know how it knows that, and that's what we're thinking about at the moment. But for cold shock, it's definitely an increase in frequency rather than an increase in depth, which means you don't hyperventilate as much as you might do if you were getting the same ventilation by increasing depth rather than frequency. You do still get some hyperventilation, and as a consequence of which, in that first minute of immersion, your brain blood flow falls, and that's not a good thing. That's the thing that can lead to disorientation. But there we are, it falls. But interestingly, it doesn't fall as much as if you go to the same level of hyperventilation in terms of your end-tidal CO2 in either warm water or in air. Something about going into cold water is keeping your brain blood flow higher than it would be otherwise. So we wouldn't expect people to show the same symptoms of hyperventilation at the same level of hyperventilation if it's cold-induced as opposed to induced by other factors. And that's quite important. And we think it's to do with the blood pressure. Okay, so what about habituating this response? I like to say 2 of the 3 members of this family think that repeated immersions in cold water are good for you. Can you guess which one's not so sure? But mum and dad are, as usual, correct, even though dad's wearing flip-flops on the ice and mum's holding what looks like a power lead, because you do see a very significant reduction. What we also know, this is the reduction you see in ventilation, and this is a reduction you see in heart rate over just a few immersions. In fact, you can get a pretty significant reduction in as few as 6 3-minute immersions in cold water, and that reduction is about 50%, and it lasts about 14 months in terms of that cold shock response. You can also get a response in a water that's slightly warmer than you want to go into, so you don't have to go freezing cold in order to get some protection against very cold water. Not so with deep body temperature, incidentally. That's very specific adaptation. And we know that the frontal cortex of the brain is important for the development, but not the maintenance of that adaptation. And we also know, because of this rather intriguing experiment we did, that if you repeatedly immerse that side of the body in cold water with a fairly useless wetsuit on the other side, but that keeps that side dry. If you repeatedly immerse one side of the body, then you get that habituation. If you then take this off and swap it round and immerse the other side, you still see the habituation. So it's nothing to do with the peripheral cold receptors. It's central to those receptors. Let's talk about the heart a little bit. Now, you see, we've got a theory. We throw out a lot of theories which aggravate all kinds of people, and then we start a discussion, and some way, 2 years later, we write something, we say we think we were wrong. But it's fun, you know, that's what science is about, challenging hypotheses, testing those hypotheses. So we think more people die in immersion from cardiac-related problems than we currently think. 2 reasons. Most of the data we have on cardiac responses are from young, fit, healthy individuals who had 12-lead ECGs before they've been put anywhere near cold water. And the other thing is, you can have a cardiac problem that can disable you in the water. It may be an electrical disturbance, so it won't be seen at post-mortem, but the final moments of your life involve you in agonal gasping, like this, which takes water into the lung and looks just like drowning. So we have to think about that. We know that if you just give somebody a head-out immersion, you'll see, and young, fit, healthy individuals, you'll see about a 1 to 3% incidence of arrhythmia or dysrhythmia. If you ask them to hold their breath as long as they can whilst you do that, it goes up to about 60%. And if they are still getting a stimulation to the face with all of those cold receptors, then it goes up to about 80%. Now, the thing about the face, of course, is that's stimulating the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve, which is a vagal input. So what do I mean by that is that's stimulating the parasympathetic system rather than the sympathetic system. So you've got the cold shock trying to make the heart go higher, and you've got the parasympathetic side, the diving response, trying to slow it down. So you've got these 2 competing responses. One's trying to produce a tachycardia, and one's trying to produce an increase in heart rate, and one's trying to produce a decrease in heart rate. I like this slide because I like that, because you know you're doing a tough experiment when you exchange a medic for a priest. And there we are. That's the kind of confused human heart rates that you get, ECGs rather, and you can reproduce that in an isolated heart, which our colleagues and co-workers, Mike Shattuck, James Winter, James Clark up at the King's College in London, this is what we're working on at the moment. You can reproduce almost exactly those human ECG abnormalities by stimulating and simulating that conflict between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic sides of the autonomic nervous system by having a constant background of adrenaline or noradrenaline with little periods of acetylcholine being pumped in to simulate that stimulation. Our most recent work, not yet published, seems to suggest that it's the sudden adrenergic stressor that increases the severity of the arrhythmic events. That may have some implications for the work John Long was telling us about with the adrenaline project. A sudden pulse of adrenaline seems to be pro-arrhythmic. So that may be an interesting line that we can start talking about. It's a hypothesis. It could be wrong. I'm as far along the branch as I can be without falling off it. So there we are. That's autonomic conflict. That's the summary of it. And I can tell you that we could take everyone in this room, I could ask you to go under the water, hold your breath, and 80% of you would show a dysrhythmia or an arrhythmia within about 10 seconds of breaking your breath hold. That's fine. I think that's almost normal. What makes it abnormal is when that arrhythmia descends into something like torsade de pointes or some other rhythm that is potentially fatal. So what makes that happen? Well, we think there are a whole range of things, cofactors, that can make that happen. So let's look at one of them. There's a QT interval that doesn't match the prevailing heart rate. Just bear with me and we'll talk a bit about it. If I stick my face into cold water, I will induce the diving response, just like a seal would get or a whale would get, and you see this decrease in heart rate. This is from Wong et al. At Mike Shattuck's lab. Now, normally what happens is, firstly, we know that the QT interval in the ECG here approximates the action potential duration, and normally, if you get a decrease in heart rate, it prolongs that action potential. However, what happens when you put your face into water is the heart rate falls and there's no change in that QT interval. And that's pro-arrhythmogenic. So when you go under the water and you're holding your breath, you'll see a nice heart rate fall, but actually the action potential, the nervous input into the heart, isn't changing. And that's dangerous. It does change, but it takes too long. When you come out and you break your breath hold and the heart rate goes shooting back up, then the opposite happens. It takes time for the QT interval, the action potential duration, to match what's going on with rate. And abrupt change, here's that word again, abrupt change, a rapid decrease in heart rate with no change in the action potential duration can lead to re-entrant arrhythmias, and if the action potential remains long following a rapid increase in heart rate, then you've got the chance of ventricular automaticity and arrhythmias. So that's one mechanism by which it can occur. I'm just going to mention another one, which is long QT syndrome. So some people have an ECG where there's a long QT interval, and it's both inherited and it's acquired. And so, for example, the post-mortem study by Tester et al. In 2011 using DNA revealed that nearly 30% of victims of seemingly unexplained drowning had cardiac ion channel mutations. Some of these people were thought to have committed suicide, but they had. Now, that doesn't prove anything. That's an association, not a cause, but it's interesting to see that. We know that there's a strong association between swimming and sudden cardiac arrest in children with heritable long QT syndrome. Ishikawa has shown that 51 of 64 children with known long QT syndrome develop significant arrhythmias while swimming. And so there is definitely an association between cardiac arrhythmias, children, swimming, and long QT syndrome. That's inherited. The other interesting thing, which again, we're right at the forefront of what we're doing, I can give you no solid answers, is that certain drugs will take a normal ECG and prolong the QT interval. And there's a whole list of them there. The most common that you're probably aware of and probably taking are antihistamines. So individuals on such drugs may be at greater risk of cardiac arrhythmias. Okay, I'm going to start this video because it's going to just run behind me. I hope. Is it? Hang on. Oh, That's interesting. Let me know if that line starts to move. Yeah, I will. Let's try that. There we go. Okay, so you see the time up here. You can see a time about there. That's a guy 1 minute before he goes under the water. And this is just a bog standard test. It's the CAA test in the UK of emergency breathing systems. You have to be able to go under 12-degree water for at least a minute, and to show that the system works. I've said that submersion, particularly with breath holding, is a pretty good way of inducing an ECG arrhythmia or a dysrhythmia. So what you'll see in a moment is this guy who's got a really quite a nice resting heart rate of 64 gets quite excited about the prospect of going under the water. You'll then see a diving response. You'll see that parasympathetic input from the face, all those facial receptors, slowing the heart. So he's going in 4 seconds, 3, 2, 1. Right, so his heart rate, you'll see, will go up a bit. It takes about 15 seconds to get him under the water. There we go. You can see his heart rate's gone up, yeah? That's a bit faster now. Now he's under the water. Now, the interesting thing about this, he's breathing, because he's using an emergency breathing system. There's no breath hold in this test. But even so, look what happens to his ECG. So now you can see a bradycardia developing, the diving response, which is the diving mammal's response for staying underwater. But because he's still breathing, you get little periods where it speeds up. And after about a minute, it's a 90-second test, this starts to happen. Perfectly fit, young, healthy guy. And a good, obviously you stop the test at this point. But just watch, you get him out of the water, he comes out of the water, he's now out of the water, one unusual, and then boom, back to a sinus rhythm. Now, that's autonomic conflict, but that's thrown a bit of a spanner into the works, because that was a guy breathing, and we'd always associated this with breath holding. But we're now thinking that perhaps we know that the diving response takes a while to develop in humans, 30 seconds to 40 seconds, and also the noradrenaline and adrenaline levels take a while to increase. You get the neural response very quickly. So we're now starting to look at what's happening to the hormonal responses and the stress hormone responses on immersion. Because that's the amount of work. You don't need to read this slide. But each one of those boxes is a study we've done trying to understand autonomic conflict. I just want to get, as I say, if you take nothing else away from this, understand that the kind of information that is put out, sometimes fairly glibly, about what goes on the first-minute immersion is underpinned by decades. This is the 30th anniversary of me publishing in this area this year, and there's a lot of work involved. The breath hold one here is now, it is a big input, but we also know that not breath holding can produce it, so we're not quite back to the drawing board, but we're doing a lot of work. So just to finish off now, because it's John's turn, during cold water immersion, autonomic conflict that is a powerful proarrhythmic stimulus increases the likelihood of problematic cardiac arrhythmias. It may not be unique to cold water, and we're already seeing it mentioned as a source of problems in altitude. And incidentally, if you want to improve your performance at altitude, you can adapt to cold water, and it improves your performance at altitude. Another area, because academics learn more and more about less and less until you know everything about nothing, you forget to look across the piece occasionally. But because we do altitude, heat, cold, but my first love, cold water immersion, we've always asked the question, well, if I adapt to this, does it help me here? And sure enough, it's published, Journal of Physiology, cold water immersion, habituation improves your performance at altitude. Read the paper. There we are. We won't go through this slide because actually, functionally, we have been through this slide. It's a slide that started in 1989 and has been added to over the last 30 years. This is the most recent stuff on autonomic conflict that we've talked about. We've talked about all of this. So I've actually taken you through that. So what, you all say? So you know a lot about the physiology of going into the first minute of immersion. Well, the so what is, you can now start to say, okay, now this is where you can start to intervene. And so this slide, which I've called the physiological pathways to drowning, what you need to do is cut those pathways. And we're all trying to do that. The really nice thing about this group is we all have the same aim. Some of you may be doing it through education, through teaching, we do it by providing information that we hope others can use to help people survive and make sure that when they do survive, they're in the best condition they can be. So this slide just has a whole load of mitigation and interventions. There's cold habituation, there's emergency breathing system, there's fitness, there's fatness, there's all different kinds. Right down to if you want to organise an event that's an open water swimming event, just try and organise it in a way that you don't get people swimming all over each other, that they don't have... Oh, sorry. It's really good on here.
Mike, why don't we see more people dying at these?
Because you know, there's not a lot of people do die in that way. The question is, there's a lot of them having an arrhythmia or a dysrhythmia, and there are people that do die. I mean, so for example, in the US triathlon, latest statistics, 80% of those that die in triathlons die in the swim. And these are young, fit, generally, or older, fit people who have trained in water. So what is it about the swim? And it's a combination of that diving response, the autonomic conflict, augmented by the fact that they have to extend their breath hold, because when they're training they can just breathe, but when they turn to breathe in an event, there's somebody there, a foot, a splash. They also get angry, and by the way, anger is the one emotion that ups both sides of the autonomic nervous system, parasympathetic and sympathetic, which is why most people on a coronary ward report that the last emotion they had was anger. Don't get angry, get even.
Just exit your slideshow and go back into it. Just need to
Yep. Thank you. So that was a perfect question. Thank you, Linda, because that's what we're talking about. The one that threw us slightly was why more people weren't dying because of the ice bucket challenge. There were some that died, and we think it's probably because when they poured the bucket on their head, they put their chin on their chest, and there was a plume of water went on the back of their head, but not much on their face. Speaking of which, thank you, that's my summary. And really, I hope there was something in there which interested you. I didn't want to do the same talk as I've done in the past, but I wanted to just show you everything you've just heard about in the last 35 minutes is the background information to what we would talk about just about the first minute of immersion. That's nothing to do with hypothermia, that's nothing to do with circumrescue collapse, that's nothing to do with the rest of it. So, gives you some feel for the work that's going on in terms of physiology to support some of the things which you read about. Those of you are interested can read some more, or this particular website here, which is ResearchGate, has all our publications on that are chapters and reviews, so you can just go and download those. There's a reasonably new recent book this year, Beach Lifeguarding, Science of Beach Lifeguarding. If anybody wants to read about that, the physiology, the pathophysiology, the RIPS and all the different stuff, I've got a copy there which you can have a look through. Thank you very much for your attention.